between jazz and classical saxophone. In this video, I'm going to try and show you some of the differences in approaches to the saxophone between what we call classical saxophone, which is a term I don't really like, and jazz saxophone. There are many different ways of playing the saxophone. I'm going to focus on the difference between two of those styles, what we call classical saxophone and what we call jazz saxophone. But of course the saxophone is used in so many different styles of music. A lot of what is studied in the academy nowadays is generally put into these two brackets, especially in the Western world, jazz or classical. So what are they? Let's break them down. Classical saxophone is essentially what has come out of the pedagogy associated with the Paris Conservatory, which is where Adolphe Sax, the inventor of the instrument, taught at the end of the 19th century. That academy was then designed to teach musicians that would be playing in military bands on his instruments. That class was closed when he stopped teaching there and reopened in the middle of the 20th century in 1942 by a man called Marcel Mule. Marcel Mule was a French saxophone player. We often refer to him as the founder of the French school of classical saxophone, which has been propagated around the world in different academies since. As in a lot of pedagogies in the academy, the Paris Conservatory has been very influential, particularly in woodwind pedagogy, flute, clarinet, saxophone, French bassoon. The saxophone has a great deal of repertoire that comes from this school, from this style, things that were written for the exams, things that were written for the entrance and exit exams of the Paris Conservatory still make up a large amount of the repertoire we study at the conservatory or at music university. And that has a great influence on the way we play the instrument, because to play these pieces in a stylistically correct manner, we have to play it in the French way. And so the French way of playing is really characterized by a pure sound, a clarity of articulation, sometimes by a certain kind of vibrato. I'll talk a little bit about vibrato in another video, but vibrato is kind of linked to Marcel Mule because he created this, I would say, very strange way of doing vibrato that was copied by a lot of his students, and that became somehow an academic way of playing the saxophone. But you will come across students of this classical saxophone tradition all across the world, and they will usually have trained using pieces that require a lot of dexterity as regards to finger technique and articulation and control of the sound and a real purity of sound. This is essentially my background. I grew up playing jazz, but when in my 20s I moved to France and studied classical saxophone. I studied at the Paris Conservatory, but I like to think of myself more as a saxophone player more than a classical saxophone player. I attempt to create the sound that the composer imagines when I work with a composer, and so it's very important for me to communicate to you the flexibility of the sound in the saxophone. Jazz saxophone tradition is perhaps a little bit more well known, and a really important part of that tradition is creating an individual sound. So it's much harder to say that a jazz sound is going to be like this or like that, because there's not a model. Everyone's trying to find their own unique sound, which is a really important part of that. So when working with a musician that comes from that tradition as a composer, it's a very different working experience. The relationship to the score is also going to be very different. From someone with a jazz background to a classical background, we have a very different relationship to the score. As a classical musician, obviously the score is kind of our Bible. We have to do everything that the score says. Whereas as a jazz musician, the score is more of an indication sometimes, and we can extrapolate and create things and ornament that in the style. So one thing you might hear people talking about is jazz mouthpieces, or even jazz saxophones that are better suited to playing jazz or classical music and all that kind of business. Essentially it's an approach of the way of playing the instrument. It's not the instrument itself. There are mouthpieces that'll help you get a more jazzy sound or a more classical sound, but it's not the mouthpiece or the instrument that's going to give you that sound. It's the approach that you have to the instrument. For example, these are my two different setups. They're not so different. This mouthpiece I have for playing jazz is a little bit more open, because it allows me to have a bit more of a louder sound and a bit more flexibility, and this classical one's a little bit more close to help me get a more pure sound. So this is my classical setup. I said, it's an approach to the instrument. It's the way we play. Our instrument is essentially here as a saxophone player. This is where all the sound comes from. So if I play this same mouthpiece in the way I played the jazz setup, it doesn't have as much guts as that mouthpiece, but you can still hear that it doesn't sound like a classical instrument anymore. And on the same token, I can play this jazz mouthpiece in the same way that I would play on the classical setup. It's really about the way we play the saxophone. It's all in here, essentially. So if you hear saxophone players going on about, oh, this mouthpiece makes me sound like this or like that or like that, it's all rubbish. They just need to practice. I think it's important to understand the priorities that musicians may have when choosing material or finding a sound. For example, when I'm choosing mouthpieces and gear to help me find the sound that I'm looking for as a jazz musician or as an improvising musician, I choose gear that is usually a little bit more open, that has a bit more punch to it, and that is a bit richer in the partials. It's a bit brighter maybe. The trade-off for that is that it's often a bit airier, the sound. You don't have the clarity and precision that you do with the classical gear. So if you're writing music that's really precise, really clear, tiny articulations and tiny clear sounds, that kind of thing is maybe going to be a little bit harder on this kind of setup than on the classical gear. And in the same way, the classical setup that I have on the different saxophones has really been chosen to have a purity of sound, clarity of articulation, and a homogeneous sound across all the different registers, which is great for certain things. But if I were to be working with a composer on a piece where I needed to have a big, full, rich sound inspired by maybe a jazz musician, I wouldn't use my classical setup because it wouldn't allow me to have that full, rich, bright tone that I would need. I switch gear a lot of the time when doing different pieces. I have a whole range of different mouthpieces, from that kind of really closed setup all the way to this one, which is quite open, and everything in between, 4 different pieces that require different things. A lot of the times the mouthpieces that are designed for jazz musicians will allow you to have a lot more partials, will allow you to have a brighter, richer sound. Rich not in the sense of dark and round and solid, but kind of rich in partials. And often I'll improvise on these mouthpieces more than I will on the classical ones. So I'll just go through the different saxophones and play them in the 2 different ways, so you can get an idea of the different sound worlds that I have between the 2 different ways of playing. But again, you'll have to discover every different performer that you're working with and see what kind of sound worlds they have. I hope that was helpful. Thanks for stopping by. If you have any questions, put them in the comments. Remember to like this video, subscribe to my channel for more exciting videos like this one, and comment the name of the piece you're working on that this video has helped you with so that we can check it out.